Cliff Richard has always seemed well-groomed and charming, like the clean-cut face of British pop. But behind that calm appearance was a wound that had been bothering him for a long time. And John Lennon was the first person to do it. They seemed very different to most people. Cliff was the cool kid. John is the voice of an age of rebels. The roads they took were never straight. The battle wasn't just on the charts either. Cliff didn't say anything for decades. Even when reporters pressed him, even when the Beatles were made saints, and even after he died. Cliff has finally opened up now that he is 83 years old. Fans all over the world are shocked by what he just said about John Lennon. Because it wasn't a race or a matter of who sold more songs. It had to do with something much worse and more painful. Cliff has kept this secret for more than 50 years. Cliff Richard was the face of British rock and roll in the late 1950s. Cliff was at the top of the charts, music halls were packed, and the press loved his boyish smile and smooth voice long before the Beatles came out. A lot of people thought he was like Elvis in Britain. He had radio hits, TV shows, specials, and a group of loyal fans who thought he was the perfect guy next door their age. He was polite, quiet, and well-groomed. Parents gave their okay. The press liked how polite he was. Still, not all people in the music scene agreed. Because while Cliff was making history, a group of driven young artists from Liverpool were enjoying the show. John Lennon was one of them. Lennon didn't want to be Cliff. He wanted to destroy what Cliff stood for. That picture of safety and sweetness that made Cliff so popular was, to Lennon, the enemy of artistic defiance. He didn't keep quiet about it either. As the Beatles' fame grew, John aimed his arrows not only at the music establishment, but also at the people who stood for it. The bad guys were after Cliff, and he didn't like it. It began with sarcastic comments in interviews, jokes about Cliff's style, his songs, and even his fans. Lennon didn't hold back. Some people might have thought it was just harmless small talk, but Cliff felt it. In those early years, he had never met Lennon in person. The attacks came from afar, either through the media or in the wings of events they had never been to together. Cliff, being a true worker, never answered back. He smiled through it all, didn't pay attention to the news, and didn't respond to the jabs. But it hurt behind the scenes. Because Cliff wasn't just another pop star. Without even having a record deal, he had worked hard, risen quickly, and carried the weight of a whole movement. He was not trying to hurt anyone. He really liked music. He also didn't get why Lennon, who he had never sworn at or insulted, seemed to make fun of him all the time. Cliff ignored it for many years. He told himself it was just John being John, and that Lennon was attacking everyone, not just him. But there was a question that kept coming up. Why him? Why did Lennon want to break down everything Cliff had made? Cliff wouldn't say that question out loud for many years. By the end of the 1960s, the Beatles were famous all over the world. People thought Lennon was brilliant, and Cliff, who was still making records and selling them, was seen as part of the old guard. Respectable, but not new anymore. Even though he kept acting and smiling, that first wound never went away. It was sad that John Lennon died in 1980, but Cliff didn't say much about it. Nothing was said in public or to the press to honor them. There was only silence. Because Cliff still wasn't okay with what they had done to each other. That quiet became part of the story as the years went by. Why didn't he talk about John Lennon? He always seemed to pause when people asked him about the Beatles. What did he really not want to say? Cliff didn't say anything until he was in his 80s. He wasn't quiet for a long time out of pride either. It hurt. By the middle of the 1960s, the Beatles were unbeatable. They changed the way music, clothes, and even fame were made. What they said was important. The people liked what they thought. The whole world paid attention when John Lennon spoke. This change wasn't just for Cliff Richard's job. It was about them. He was the first rock and roll star to do well in Britain. He made things happen in Liverpool before the Beatles were even known there. But all of a sudden, the light changed. Critics started to change the facts of history. Cliff was no longer the first person in British music history. It all began with the Beatles, and Lennon made sure of that. Jokes that were once meant to be funny turned into a public story that put Cliff in a bad light. At first, Cliff tried not to think about it. He told himself that it was how things should be. Each age group has its own sound. Every artist has changed at some point. But it wasn't the loss of fame that scared him. The fact that so many people believe Lennon's story. Someone John said out of the blue could erase 10 years of Cliff's work. He was right when he said Cliff's music was stupid and that his words were meaningless. He wasn't a real artist, and it worked. DJs on the radio started to like sounds with more grit. When it came to music, Cliff was the standard for what not to be. Cliff stood for the old order if the Beatles stood for the shift. Outdated, made, and safe. Cliff couldn't explain how it hurt to anyone, not even himself. Since it wasn't about pride, it was about who you are. He had put everything he had into every show, song, and phrase. People didn't fight for artistic control like he did. He took risks and pushed the limits. But from what Lennon said about him, you'd think he was just a suit-wearing marketing tool. It wasn't just what Lennon said. It was what they did. Artists under 30 started saying that Cliff was an influence on them. Labels no longer thought he was important. Fans didn't remember his early wins because they were too young to remember them. They were told Cliff Richard didn't matter. In his own time, Cliff started to think about everything. Did Lennon get it right? Did he play it too safe? Was his career built more on charm than on skill? That was a terrible truth for someone who had always tried to be kind. He didn't want to be as good as the Beatles. He liked how smart they were. But respect didn't keep him from being fired. For Cliff, it wasn't the judgment that was awful. It was the silence that came next. Not many people in the business stood up for him. Most people were too impressed with Lennon to disagree with him. Cliff had helped British artists get jobs for years. It was time for those doors to close. He never said anything bad about John. Not once. The press never had a story about him. Never talked back with insults. But he paid for his silence. In a field that needs noise to work, it can look like you're weak to keep quiet. He didn't say anything, though. He didn't say anything because he didn't feel like it, but because he knew that if he did, it would start a war. Cliff had never been interested in war either. He wished for peace. He wanted the truth. But peace can only go so far. And when Cliff did speak, it wasn't to attack. He talked to get back. Because no one had ever heard that story before. Time that passed a long time after the Beatles were at their best. Something Cliff had never talked about. Fans thought everything they knew about him, and Lennon changed when he finally told them. There were no cameras around the only time Cliff Richard and John Lennon ever met in real life. It didn't happen on stage, and no one was there to see it. It was a quiet hallway behind the scenes at a BBC studio in the early 1970s. Their entrances were supposed to happen on different shows, but they happened at the same time for just long enough. Cliff first saw him leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and a cigarette in his mouth. John looked older and more tired than the news stories said he would. The hall wasn't very long, but it seemed like it went on forever at that moment. They gave each other a short nod. There were no fights or smiles, just a mood that Cliff would later describe as tense, unsure, and unforgettable. The most important thing to him was what wasn't said. The things Lennon said about Cliff had already changed how many people saw him by that time. The music business started to treat him like an old artifact, someone safe and well-groomed who belonged to a time in pop history that didn't seem important anymore. But Cliff didn't feel like a foe when he was in that hallway with Lennon. He thought that John was trying to figure out something about him, something that he hadn't quite figured out himself. Years later, Cliff would think about how tense things had always been between them. He didn't say that Lennon was hateful. In fact, he once said that Lennon's jabs might have been a sign of a greater anger, not at Cliff himself, but at what Cliff had come to stand for. The music business puts charm over meaning and mass appeal over rebellion. Cliff never defended himself in public while John Lennon was still living. In return, he never replied. He didn't try to make things right. But that lack of noise wasn't lethargy. It was to protect myself. In secret, he wondered if John was right. Was he too open to letting the company shape his image? Had he lost charge of his story? Cliff was most interested in whether Lennon's short encounter with him in the hallway was a way of acknowledging something that wasn't said, like artistic disapproval, or whether there was something close to respect buried deep beneath the smirk and the quiet. We'll never be sure. Cliff didn't tell the story until many years later, when the memory was just clear enough to go back to. Lennon never talked about it. But even then, he never made it into a big deal. He didn't make up specifics. Without giving away too much, he just said that seeing Lennon in person changed everything. In that hallway, it became clear that the space between them wasn't just artistic, it was also personal. For Cliff, it made him think about something that he still did long after Lennon died. Was it enough that he did? Not for the people or the charts, but for himself. There were jabs and years of being fired, but that quiet moment backstage gave Cliff something else. A mirror. He saw not only the shadow of John Lennon, but also the shape of his own legacy, which was still standing even though it wasn't finished and was being misread. Cliff Richard was a mainstay of British music for many years. Even though the business world changed around him, he quietly adjusted. He was never panicky or defensive. He kept making records. He went on tour. But John Lennon's words stayed with fans longer than they knew. As music tastes changed and retrospectives became popular in the 1980s and 1990s, Cliff's talents were often pushed to the edges. There were films about the Beatles, the Stones, and the changes in culture in the 1960s. Cliff was treated like an aside, even though he helped start British rock and roll years before anyone else. He knew what was going on, but he didn't fight it. The sting never really went away, though. It was the first time a British artist had a #1 song, and the first time they tried to beat the American pop charts. He had made it possible for the Beatles to become famous. But when the story was told again, his name was often left out or, even worse, made fun of as old, unimportant, or sanitized. It wasn't just a public snub. It was about them. Cliff didn't fight back for a long time. He didn't say that because he agreed, but because he didn't think they would hear the truth. He turned into the artist that people thought they knew. Safe, easy, and nice. But deep down, he wasn't done. Cliff became more honest as he got older. He didn't talk about Lennon directly, but he did talk about what it meant to leave a legacy in the shadow of someone else. He began to take back the story, not out of anger, but through memory and clarity. He began listening to his early recordings again, drawing attention to the risks he took before anyone else in Britain made rock and roll songs. In the 1950s, he talked about how the industry tried to get him to tone things down and fit in with a cleaner image so that they could sell him. How every step of his career had been shaped not only by the decisions he made but also by the concessions he had to make. Most of all, how it felt to be seen as the opposite of John Lennon, when all he ever wanted to do was make music that would last. Fans started to listen again, but this time they paid more attention. It wasn't just about who had the biggest hits. It was about who made it out alive. And Cliff had made it through everything. There was the rise of the Beatles, the rise of punk, the drop in sales, and even the press's loss of respect for him. Over time, his image began to change because he kept going. Something changed, but not a lot or right away. His songs began to be heard by new generations. He was one of the critics who started in the timelines they had previously cut him out of. Many artists had stood on his shoulders without realizing it, and other artists paid tribute to him in a quiet way. Cliff never hit Lennon during the whole thing. He did not change the past. He did nothing more than add his voice. He changed the way the competition was seen for what it really was. There is no feud. There is a mistake. Two men from the same time who were shaped by different beliefs and saw things in different ways. Lennon never said sorry for what he said, but Cliff didn't need to. He had to be heard. That part hurt for a long time. It's not that Lennon was mean, but that everyone had only heard what he had to say and never asked Cliff for his side of the story. Cliff was finally telling it after all these years, and fans were ready to hear it. But the most surprising thing is that Cliff still liked Lennon after all that quiet. And in the next part, we'll show you the biggest surprise of all. What Cliff said about John Lennon. In the background, quietly, and without any attention. Cliff Richard always admired John Lennon's ability, even when things got tough. Even though he didn't agree with the jabs or the firings, he got a better sense of them over time. Things that at first seemed like personal attacks turned out to be anger between two artists who wanted different things from the same business. Lennon wanted the facts. Cliff desired a long life. They both got what they wanted, but only one lived to see how it all worked out. Cliff didn't say anything after Lennon's death in 1980. He didn't rush to tell stories to the press or appear on memorial shows. A lot of people thought he had chosen to be quiet. That wasn't the whole story, though. Cliff felt the loss more deeply than most people knew. Perhaps not because they lived close, but because in some strange way, their lives had always been linked. Even though they had only met once, Lennon changed how people saw Cliff. Cliff couldn't change how their story ended now that John was gone. However, he could and did choose to do something less loud. Cliff started playing one song from Lennon's death in his live shows a few years after the singer died. He never made a big deal out of it, and never explained his decisions. Every night, though, he would play a cover of Imagine in the middle of his shows. It was a surprise for the crowd. Cliff, the romantic singer who always looked so good, singing John Lennon's most famous song. There were no extra dancers or fancy sets. It was just Cliff and the words. He never said it was an honor. He didn't tell a story about John before the game. His tone of speech, on the other hand, said it all. It was kind, soft, and a little broken around the edges. It's like someone finally admitting something they couldn't say out loud. Fans took notice. Some did not understand. Some people were moved. But those who knew the past between them, those who remembered the news stories, the criticisms, and the silence, saw it for what it was. This was Cliff's answer. Not an answer or a defense, just a song. In an interview years later, Cliff was asked why he decided to perform Imagine. He gave a simple answer. He said, "It spoke to hope, healing, and the idea that the world could be something better if we just listened." It was one of the most powerful songs ever written. He didn't call Lennon by name. He didn't have to, because it was clear by then what he meant. This was not a competition. It was never really there. It had to do with being noticed. During a time of societal change, the lives of two men happened at the same time. There were two famous people from the same country who had very different ideas about what music could mean. And even though Lennon had once told Cliff that he was too safe, too polished, and too industry approved, Cliff had survived the moment by singing instead of yelling louder. Cliff didn't find the last word in a book or a conversation. It was in that steady, quiet version of Imagine. He sang the song not to get praise, but to bring peace. And just maybe for John. Cliff Richard never had to show anything. He had hits, went on trips, and was successful for a long time, which is something most artists can only dream of. The story of John Lennon in the spotlight, on the other hand, wasn't about fame or leaving a legacy. It was about being quiet, and what it cost him to be quiet. Cliff didn't say anything about his past for years, while other people told it. He was given a name, pushed to the side, and summed up into a picture he never fully chose. But he never fought back the way people thought he would. He never yelled. He didn't write an open letter. His due wasn't asked for. He chose to wait until now. After 83 years, Cliff Richard finally told the truth, and not just about John Lennon. He also talked about what it's like to be misread your whole life. To be seen, but not really heard. Peers will admire you, but they will never really respect you. Fans got something they didn't know they were waiting for when he did that. Since there wasn't a fight. It was not an admission. When he looked back, he saw everything clearly for the first time and chose kindness over anger. Cliff was still admirable even after being fired a lot of times. He still found a way to honor the person who had tried to erase him, even after all that time. It takes love and strength to do that. Cliff and Lennon were never meant to go together. But for a split second, their lives were connected, and that meeting was felt in everything that followed. That's possibly why Cliff's quiet gesture meant so much. It wasn't loud. It wasn't exciting. It came from the heart. One last note in a song that never really finished. Check out this for more sad stories.